Higher education. It's not doing so great, folks. My own institution just released a proposal to cut $27 million from the budget, which currently eliminates 2 whole departments from my home college. 2. Proposed to just be gone. So the ground is feeling a little shaky. Just a bit. And then earlier last week, my phone and my email just started buzzing. I was getting texts and emails from people asking if I had seen what was happening at Texas A&M. Because if you don't work in higher ed, you may have missed it. A children's literature professor was fired within a complete day after a student filmed herself challenging content in class, particularly around gender identity. And the dean and the department head were also stripped of their administrative titles and roles. And the governor called for heads to roll. A legislator blasted the video all over social media. And by last Tuesday night, the university announced that professor was out. And it's an extremely complex situation, truly, because it sits right at the intersection of academic freedom, freedom of speech, and what we actually mean when we talk about academic responsibility. And as someone who teaches children's literature, who shared some of that teaching here, who've had my phone blowing up and people asking if I'm next, that in conjunction with the very visceral reality of my job right now, I've been pulling it apart in my head. And I want to apparently spill my beverage, but also pull it apart. Because underneath all of the politics and the panic, there are definitely some bigger questions here about what we're teaching, how we're teaching it, and ultimately who gets to decide. So, I'm Nick. This is Dr. Cranky Pants Reads, and today I'm talking about children's literature, academic freedom, and what happens when universities start treating syllabi like they're under TSA inspection. Shoes off, laptops out, and don't you dare smuggle in a slide about the gender unicorn. So here's what's happened. Let's lay out the situation in case you missed it. A student in a children's lit course at Texas A&M tells her professor that teaching about gender identity is illegal and against her religion. The professor responds basically, "No, it isn't. I have the right to teach this, and if you don't like it, you can leave." Now, this clip hits social media. A legislator blasts it as indoctrination. The governor piles on, and within 24 hours, the professor is fired. The dean and the chair are stripped of their administrative posts, and the university announces a system-wide audit of courses. Now, I want to be clear here. This is censorship. Politicians should not be dictating course content, period. But if you actually read the syllabus, and yes, I read the syllabus, it's not just gender and sexuality. It's race, disability, immigration, queerness, class, identity categories across the board. And those were foregrounded. The children's literature itself, the study of genre, narrative form, picture-text relationships, market forces, that was backgrounded. That doesn't make the syllabus evil, but it does make it misaligned because this course was advertised as a survey course. And in a survey course, you build the foundation so students can go forward and take specialized courses in multicultural or queer or disability children's literature later. Instead, the survey got structured as if it were already a special topics course. And that misalignment gave politicians a very easy opening, and they took it. So, no, this isn't indoctrination, but it also isn't a clean academic fairy tale either. It's a mess where freedom and responsibility collided, and higher ed's worst enemies were ready to pounce. And they did. Now, this is where things start to get tricky because everyone's throwing around free speech and academic freedom like they're self-explanatory, and they just aren't. So let's start with freedom of speech because, yes, both students and faculty have it. Students can object, faculty can respond. That's kind of how teaching works. But free speech doesn't mean freedom from pushback. It also means you can't hijack a classroom indefinitely, nor does it mean that faculty can slam the door shut on any conversation that just gets uncomfortable. And that's the tension here. Where's the line between asking a hard question, giving a clear answer, and cutting off dialogue altogether? And then there's academic freedom, which, in theory, faculty can teach within their discipline without political censorship. That's what's under siege when politicians demand syllabi audits. But we also have to admit, and here's where things, for me, get uncomfortable, that sometimes syllabi themselves lean into politics. This was a survey course in children's literature, and when I looked at the syllabus, identities were very much foregrounded. And to me, that feels fairly disingenuous for a survey. The whole point of a survey is to lay groundwork, genres, structures, literary tools, a broad map so students can dive into specialized areas later, including identity. And yes, I build choice into my own course. My students can self-select texts that lean heavily into identity work if that's where their interest lies. But they can also choose books that are more quote unquote classic. My job is to create doors, not push anyone through them. Which brings me to the notion of academic responsibility. Because freedom isn't carte blanche. Professors have to teach the course they advertised. It's literally our job. Students also have to engage respectfully. That's the compact. And this is part of where I keep circling back because I keep wondering about that exchange in the classroom and how that exchange could have gone differently. Could there have been a moment where the professor just asked the student to tell them more? Tell me more about why you see it that way, because here's how I'm framing it, but I want to understand this perspective. Something to acknowledge the student's objection without shutting down the entire conversation. I think there were ways forward here. I don't think that was the path that was chosen. But let me be clear that none of this justifies what happened after. The firing was political theater. The governor and the legislators pounced. But we also can't ignore that syllabus and the handling of the classroom moment gave them that opening. And that's the hard middle space I'm trying to sit in this moment. Like, academic freedom matters, but so does professional responsibility to the syllabus, to our students and to the climate we're teaching in. And that's messier than slogans make it sound. Now, don't get me wrong. There is always a little subversion. It is part of the job because teaching isn't just marching through a checklist. Sometimes you complicate categories, you poke at assumptions, and you slip in a text that unsettles the neat boxes students want to draw. Oh, you thought you were a visual learner? Guess again. And that's legitimate. That's good teaching. But there's a difference between subversion and sleight of hand. Subversion says, here's a course you signed up for, and I'm going to push you to see it from angles you didn't expect. Sleight of hand says, here's what the catalog promised, and this is actually what I've turned this into. Something else entirely. And that's the problem I keep coming back to when I look at this syllabus. It's called Children's Literature, a Survey, a big tent course, but the text list and the scholarship lean heavily, almost exclusively, on identity categories. It reads less like a survey and more like multicultural children's lit or queer children's lit, which again, fine. I would love to teach those courses. That's what topic courses are for. But you have to say that up front. Because here's the rub. When students enroll in a children's literature course, they're expecting a foundation. Genres, narrative structures, literary elements, picture book mechanics, that baseline that lets them move into deeper work later, where identity, history, politics, whatever. But if that baseline disappears or gets backgrounded, you're not subverting, you're swapping. And that's not fair to the students or the program. So yes, bring in identity. Show how the marketplace of children's literature is shaped by it, but don't let identity become the entire syllabus under the banner of a survey. Because that's not subversion. That's sleight of hand. And here's another piece of this that I don't want us to miss, because I think the virality of this story was because it's a children's literature class. If the exact same video had been filmed in, I don't know, a gender studies seminar, it wouldn't have hit the same nerve. But children's lit carries this cultural aura of innocence. We tie it to the purity of childhood and, wide-eyed innocence and moral simplicity and all that Hallmark card nonsense. So when a slide about gender identity shows up in a children's literature class, it's framed as a violation of that purity. So the outrage becomes not just, why is this in the university, but why would anyone expose children to this? And the answer to that is pretty simple. Because books like this exist for children. They exist because the market demands them. Parents, teachers, librarians, and yes, kids, they want these books. But that doesn't mean every children's lit class should turn into an identity deep dive. It does mean you can't pretend that those books don't exist. A responsible survey should cover the full spread. Exposure to the so-called classics, the contemporary hits, the books that push into identity categories, and the books that lean hard into traditional or even conservative values. In other words, children's literature has never been pure. It's commercial, it's cultural, it's contested. And part of the job in a survey is to show students that landscape and give them the tools to analyze both the text and the market without collapsing the entire course into one ideological lane. You saw how over the summer I uploaded a ton of stuff from my own children's literature class. And one of the books that I used was the picture book, That Flag. And if you don't know it, the book is about two friends, one black, one white, and what happens when the Confederate flag enters their story, which is pretty heavy stuff. And I did use that in one of my videos, but I didn't bring it in on a lecture about the Civil War or to make my students debate monuments. I used it as an example of how illustrators make meaning. We looked at how the flag was positioned on the page, how the warm tones of the flag contrasted with the cool tones of the background, to do rhetorical work, how images sometimes foreshadow or even complicate the written text. That's the analysis. How does that differ? You might be asking yourself. I think the most important part here is I didn't ask my students to agree with the meaning. That's not what I'm here for. My job is to teach them how illustrators and authors construct meaning in picture books, not to hand them the conclusions. And yes, the history and identity context is in the background. You can't scrub that out. But my responsibility as an instructor is to keep the focus on children's literature as literature, to build the doors, to show students how mechanics work. And whether they walk through those doors into bigger conversations about history or politics, that's up to them. That's academic freedom paired with professional responsibility. Freedom to teach with contemporary, challenging texts, but responsibility to use them in ways that serve the course's actual purpose, not my personal soapbox. And that brings me to a slightly larger point, because there's a difference between teaching and didactic preaching. Teaching is what I just described with that flag. It's showing students how illustrators make meaning, how books are built, how narrative and image interact. It's about giving them tools so that they can analyze, question, and decide for themselves. Didactic preaching is when the goal shifts from equipping to indoctrinating. It's when the professor starts handing out conclusions instead of methods. And in higher ed, particularly survey courses, that's where I get nervous, because my job as a professor working with students isn't to clone my worldview. The job is to prepare students to critically engage with texts, even ones they disagree with. I mean, let's be really honest here. I'm a gay man teaching children's literature. My presence already signals something about identity, whether I bring it up explicitly or not. But that doesn't mean every class becomes a sermon on gender or sexuality. My responsibility is to make sure my students leave with the skills to read children's books with rigor, to parse narrative, to understand genre, to analyze illustration, and to see how the marketplace shapes what gets published. That's teaching. That's my lane. And I think it is useful to articulate the differences between what I have to do and what this course should have done. My course is part of a certification program. I am responsible to the state of Nebraska through my coursework to ensure that students work through and up to a particular number of competencies. This English course, I think, was an English course with no such restrictions placed upon it. But still, there's the compact between you as the instructor and your students as really the consumers of that course, to make sure that you're advertising what you're actually teaching. So teaching, that's my lane. And the moment that I confuse that with didactic preaching, I have lost the plot, both literally and figuratively. I keep coming back to a line in Elaine Castillo's essay collection, How to Read Now. You can't teach empathy. You just can't. Either you have it, or you're probably not going to have it. And if you haven't read that essay collection, I highly recommend at least reading the first one, How to Read Now. What you can do, though, is you can teach books. You can teach how they work, how authors and illustrators make meaning, how markets shape what shows up on shelves. You can give students tools to notice, to analyze, to sit with complexity. But you cannot make them feel the way you want them to feel. And that's where didactic preaching goes off the rails. It assumes that empathy is something you can inject into students if you just pick the right book and hammer home the right moral. That's not how literature works. That's not how classrooms work. What literature can do is open doors. It can create conditions where empathy might happen, where a student might suddenly recognize themselves in a story or glimpse someone else's life in a completely new way. But again, that doorway, that's theirs to walk through, not mine to push them through. So when I hear faculty talk about teaching empathy as the goal of children's literature courses, I get a little twitchy because my job is not to curate my students' feelings. My job is to equip them with tools. And whether empathy follows, that's their work. So here's where I land. When the Texas A&M story broke, my phone kind of blew up. Colleagues, friends, students, is this going to happen to you next? And I get why. Children's literature looks like a soft target. Innocent kids, innocent books, the perfect stage for moral panic. But here's the thing. Academic freedom matters. I don't want politicians auditing my syllabus, telling me what I can or cannot teach. That's censorship. But I also recognize that academic freedom is not a license to do whatever I want with my syllabus. It comes with some level of professional responsibility to teach the course I advertise, to equip my students with the skills they signed up to learn, and to create space without forcing them into my conclusions. Now, what happened at A&M was messy on all sides. The professors' choices gave the politicians an opening. The politicians seized it, and the university caved in record time. No one, absolutely no one, comes out of this looking great. And that's the bigger picture. Higher ed is under extreme pressure. Budgets are being slashed, trust is eroding, and classrooms are being turned into political battlegrounds. And if we don't take professional responsibility seriously, not as a muzzle, but as a compass, we hand our critics the very weapons they want. So yes, I am cranky about academic freedom being gutted in Texas. But I'm also cranky about us pretending academic freedom is the end of the story, the get out of jail free card. Because it isn't. The real story is freedom plus responsibility. And if we lose sight of that balance, we're not just losing the plot in our classrooms, we're losing the plot in higher education. It's been a week. And it's only Monday as I'm filming this. So the week is just going to continue being a week. But that's kind of where my head is.
So I was finishing the edits to this video on Friday. It is currently Sunday, the 21st. And Friday, I found out that the president of A&M left their job, connected to this incident. So the story continues to develop. I was right. It was a week.
So I appreciate you. And I hope you are well. And I will see you in the next one.